Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I think we can say that because today is our Sabbath, and that is the traditional Jewish greeting, Good Sabbath or peaceful day. Glad to have each of you for our session tonight as we look together at episode 6 of the Chosen. Tonight's program is full of powerful moments and subtle insights. So I want to try to unpack a few of those before we watch. This video begins in a place that I suspect you've probably never even envisioned as being there, which is to say, first century Jewish pawn shop. um, but pawning was fairly common in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, operating primarily out of some private shops. Emperor of Rome actually had put out he had a policy where the proceeds from properties confiscated from criminals went into a fund that was available. The state would lend money with no interest to those who would pledge valuables at twice their other value. Now, unlike in our practices, there were certain items that could not be pawned or pledged: clothing, furniture, farm equipment. These were thought to be so significant for people's personal being that they didn't want to take chances on those. But among the ancient Jews, there were other stipulations. They're spelled out I'm sure you were just reading it, Leviticus 6. Yeah, everyone's got that right top of your mind. This all boiled down to one question, really. Is it clear that whatever is being pawned or pledged has not been stolen or even falsely represented as belonging to someone who it's only been given to for safekeeping, for instance, or even simply found somewhere? This was important because if someone could prove you knowingly had property that didn't belong to you and you were lying about it, you not only had to had to return the property, you had to pay a penalty of 20% based upon the replacement value of that property. So if you found a wallet on the street, I don't know if they had wallets, but if you found a coin purse maybe, that had an ID in it, for instance, and you didn't return it, you were on the hook for that penalty along with the replacement value of all the money that was in it. And pawn shops that dealt in stolen goods had to do the same thing. In other words, if they took something that was not legally to be pledged, they not only had to pay it back in spades, but they had to pay a penalty on it. Likewise, what that meant is that there was no finders, keepers, losers, weepers principle in the Bible. If you find something and it belongs to some other person, even your enemy, you are commanded to return it to them. Now that did something. That trained people to respect the property of other people, didn't it? And it trained them to expect that others would respect their property. Imagine what that would mean today. When I watch images, not just from our own cities, but now from South Africa, of looting going on because of rioting going on, and people walking out with TVs with all kinds of things that they obviously did not purchase. It would also make bribery of government officials, as well as by mafias, really uneconomical if you had to incur those penalties. So the video opens thus when a stonemason and stonemasons. It's actually interesting that I mentioned before, I think, that the same word that we generally translate carpenter, as in Jesus' father, could equally be a stonemason. Okay, both of them are what would be called craftsmen, who worked with tools and who worked with either wood or with stone. So a stonemason brings his tools to a pawn shop, but there's a problem with the stonemason, as we'll see. Likewise, there'll be a passing comment made by James the Lesser, Jacob Mikros, little James. That would have been James, the son of Alphaeus, as opposed to big James, the brother of John, and they are the sons of who? Zebedee, Simon Peter's fishing partners. Little James doesn't get much press in the Gospels. He only appears 4 times in the New Testament, and every time it's in that list of the 12. The traditional view is espoused by Jerome, who moved to actually Bethlehem to translate the gospel from Greek into Latin, and became a really important figure in the early church. His view was that the mother of this James the Lesser was named Mary, but to make it more confusing, like there's not enough Marys in this whole story, this Mary would have been the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Okay. Now, why you would name 2 girls the same name in the same family, but I'm sure they had other pet names or something that they called them to sort of, but again, Miriam's a pretty big name. She would have been identified by St. John as the wife of Clopas, or actually Cleopas. The account of Emmaus has 2 disciples walking with Jesus on the road to Emmaus, and it doesn't say. Everybody's always thought it's 2 men, and the beards would seem to suggest that in our stained glass. But I think it's you can make a strong case, it's Cleopas and his wife who are walking to back into Emmaus. And if this Mary and Cleopas if she's the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus, what does that make James? He's the cousin of Jesus. The early church, wishing to promote the idea of the perpetual virginity of the Virgin Mary, went a little further and said that this James was the one who's later on called the brother of Jesus. He becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church. You see him in the book of Acts. And there's a little bit of reason for saying that, in that the word brother can also be understood to mean cousin. Okay? All of that would suggest this Alphaeus is the same person as this Cleopas. But it's impossible to say any of this with any degree of great certitude. But to make things further muddy, some have suggested that because Alphaeus is the name of the father of the publican Levi, or Matthew, as mentioned in Mark 2, that this James and Matthew may have actually been brothers. I tend not to think that's the case, but I got to tell you, I think we're just going to have to wait until we get to heaven and we meet them. Say, tell us who your people are, because we're having trouble tracing you down. In the meantime, the writers of The Chosen throw out this little creative nugget of their imagination. When James the Lesser, Ikobos Mikron, is talking with Simon, and Simon asks him, what did you do before you were called by Jesus? And little James replies, he's on his way to join the Jerusalem 288. Now, I suspect not many people know what that reference is, right? Sounds like a state highway, going up there. But to clue you in before you see this episode, according to 1 Chronicles 15:16, it is King David who is credited with organizing the establishment of a professional choir and orchestra for the temple, composed almost exclusively of men from the tribe of Levi, Levites. Okay. The Mishnah, which is the kind of Jewish writings that give commentary on the Torah. The Mishnah says there was never to be less than 12 singers, but there's no maximum number of singers. Then later on in the book, Chronicles 25, 6-7 says that those musicians, along with their relatives, all of whom were trained and skilled in music for the Lord, numbered 288. So according to one music historian, Avraham Sharon, liturgical music becomes a key part of the rituals that are used in the temple, with 24 choral groups consisting of those 288 musical people that took part in 21 weekly services. So if you're feeling like, well, I don't like it when we have to sing it both the morning and the evening, 21 weekly services. It's obviously a pretty select group, 288 out of the nation of Israel. This is the Vienna Boys Choir in terms of getting into it, okay? So when Simon hears that this James says he's on his way to Jerusalem to join the 288, Simon responds, yeah, and I was the chief gladiator for Caesar. I mean, it's kind of like, yeah, right. And then he hears him sing. Now, this episode picks up as well on the search of our teacher of Israel, Nicodemus, for the truth about Jesus. In the course, there's a conversation between Nicodemus and the religious authorities that are referred to as the Sanhedrin. Now, that reference is a little bit confusing because we tend to think of the Sanhedrin in terms of what was called the Great Sanhedrin. That was 71 sages, the chief priest, who's the Nasi or the prince of it, and then kind of the head of the council, and 69 other people. And they met in Jerusalem in the temple at Lishkat Lagazat, the chamber of the hewn stones. It served as the religious legislative body within the nation of Israel. And they had authority to interpret the halakha, or the walking, or the laws of the religion. They also had the authority to appoint the king and the high priest, and to supervise all the special days of atonement. And this is the great Sanhedrin that you'll be familiar with in the trial of Jesus, okay? What you don't always think about is that there were also lesser Sanhedrins. Cueing from the Greek word for council, Sanhedrin, which means literally sitting in the same place, an assembly. These smaller Sanhedrins were applied to various local bodies. They had 23 members, and they were found in most of the cities. Now, we don't know, as I shared in the first episode, whether Nicodemus is actually ever up in the Galilee. It is certainly plausible that he would have been. What argues against it is that the Sanhedrin, the great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, met every day. So he would have had to been on a break or something. But we do know that this would have been the type of lesser Sanhedrin that he met with in Capernaum if he's there. Headed by an official known as the Av Bet Din. Av, A-V or A-B, meaning father, as in Abba. Bet Din, the father of the court. Now that's still a term used in modern Israel, by the way. The Av Bet Din is the chairman of the civic or the rabbinical courts. So in this episode, Nicodemus, who would have been a member of the great Sanhedrin, thus appears before this lesser Sanhedrin, and it's Av Bet Din, to talk about John the Baptizer. They're all hot and bothered about John. And his judgment is that the crowd which has come out to see John at the Jordan River are not gathering to be immersed as they understand ritual cleanings. They're just there out of curiosity. They're a crowd because there is a crowd. and they've gone to see why there's a crowd. Um, when I was a teenager, I went to Astrodome, no, to Astro World one day when it was still there, and they had this little amphitheater, this little shell, and there was nothing in it. It's where they would have performances. And we had about 10 people, so we just formed a line outside of it. And you couldn't see what it was going to. And pretty soon there were 50 people in line behind us for this empty shell. Because, I mean, a crowd gathers a crowd, right? This is what Nicodemus says is going on. I think we could say that he has it incorrect, however, not having seen the scene at the Jordan for himself. It's pretty clear John is indeed performing purification rituals, influenced perhaps by the Essenes, this kind of isolationist, separatist community that lives out by the Dead Sea because nobody else does, who live along the western shore there at Ein Gedi, and they have daily washings for purification going on. At any rate, Anito tries to downplay the baptizer's activities with the Alphabet Deem and his Lesser Sanhedrin, and he largely succeeds in doing so in this version. Now, we're also going to pick up on the story of Matthew, our favorite Asperger's tax collector, son of the other Alphaeus, also known as what? Levi. The Hebrew version of his name, by the way, is Matith Yahu, which means the gift of Yahweh, the gift of God. In his interchange with the Roman prefect, Dominus, as he calls him, there's a great line, by the way, in which the Roman will say to Matthew, how you are not a stain on a cartwheel. That is the wheel of a cart, not the acrobatic thing. How you're not a stain on a cartwheel is a mystery we will have many moons to unravel. Now that's kind of an awkward compliment to give to someone. But in turn, Matthew will tell the Roman that conquest is not simply conquering nations, but imposing a new way of life. Conquest is not simply conquering nations, but imposing a new way of life. What does that say to becoming a follower of Jesus, by the way? What does that suggest? If Jesus is going to win over people's hearts, it's going to change their lives, right? You remember that I mentioned before that I think I did in the land of Israel at the time, the Romans built at least 10 cities, the Decapolis, 10 cities, and some of them are on the eastern side of the Jordan, most of them on the western side of the Jordan. Well, it's kind of mixed up. And the point of these whole cities is to demonstrate to the Jewish population how great Rome is. And if you come over to our way of thinking, our way of living, our way of doing things, this is what you get, okay? There's even a city that you can see on the eastern side, or excuse me, on the western side, the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee, across the lake, sits up on a hill that is the city of Hippos, and it even has outdoor lighting. They have figured out how to have lights at night all over that city, sitting up on a hill. You remember when Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, you are the light of the world? He's pointing right over to Hippos, a city set up on a hill, cannot be hid. So this is what's going on with the Romans, and they want people to not only be conquered by the Roman army, they want them to be persuaded and convinced by the Roman life and the Roman beliefs. How does this describe the people that we've met so far in this series? How would you judge them? Say Matthew, Simon, Mary, Nicodemus, Andrew, any of them, you think? Any of them convinced? Yeah. They're not going to. And in point of fact, we mentioned before, Nazareth itself, where Jesus comes from, is a tiny community made up of people who are ardent keepers of Torah and will have nothing to do whatsoever with the Romans and their lifestyle. Um, now, towards the end of this episode, Matthew will also say to Simon and Andrew about the Romans, he will say, they don't believe what I saw, speaking of that miraculous catch of fishes. Then he'll add, but I do, and I need to know if I was deceived. How powerful is that? I need to know if I've been deceived, if somehow this is all a trick. Now, I want to mention as well that we will meet in this episode a new character, one which the writers have envisioned and fashioned not out of the scriptural witness, but out of their own sanctified imaginations. In the story, she will be called Tamar, Tamar, and will be said to come from Ethiopia. So were there Ethiopian Jews in Israel at the time of Jesus? Anybody know? Is this just a bow to political correctness, having an African American figure in this story? Or she's not African American, she'd be African. Yeah. A group known as the Beta Israel, the House of Israel, lives in Israel today, which claims descent from Menelik, who is said to be the son of the Queen of Sheba, Makeda, and King Solomon. Their meeting is mentioned in 1 Kings 10, 2 Chronicles 9. Now, it's not clear if that's actually so, but what we do know is that there were peoples in Ethiopia who converted to Judaism in the centuries before the time of Christ, and who lived there. They kept Sabbath, they practiced circumcision, they had synagogue services, they followed some of the dietary laws of Judaism, etc. And according to some traditions, one half of the population of Ethiopia was Jewish before Christianity was actually proclaimed the official religion there in the 300s. Today, that's less than half of 1%. But their influence was significant. Some of you may remember that even Christian emperors, Haile Selassie, does anybody remember him? Okay, Haile Selassie, emperor of Ethiopia, wore a Star of David on his crown and called himself the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, elect of God. In Israel itself, over 3,000 Ethiopian Jews, now known as black Jews, lived there. But again, were they in Israel at the time of Jesus? One verse out of the prophet Zephaniah, which you were probably reading right after you finished Leviticus, dated somewhere around 630 BC, gives us a hint of this. Zephaniah 3:10 says, "From beyond the rivers of Cush," Cush is the upper Nile region. And remember that when we say upper, we don't mean northern, we mean more to the source of the Nile River, which is actually southern. So Egypt is the lower Nile, Ethiopia is the upper Nile, okay, even though it's south of Egypt. That's the land called Cush. From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshipers, my scattered people will bring me offerings. Zephaniah writes this 400 years before Jesus. So that would suggest Zephaniah knew of at least some Jewish community in East Africa before the fall of even Solomon's temple, which in turn probably means some Ethiopian Jews live in the land of Israel. Tamar is a fictional character, but she's not one out of keeping with what may have been the sort of demographics of the land of Israel at that time. Yeah, Eddie. They will speak Arabic to each other, yeah, Egyptian or Arabic. The land of Cush at one point is a bigger empire than Egypt. it encompasses Egypt. So I think there's a kind of a broader, this is my neighborhood of the world, and Jesus responds to her speaking in her language, which of course blows all the disciples away. You know, he speaks Arabic. Of course, he speaks Arabic. He's Jesus. So Tamar plays an important role in the story tonight because she witnesses the healing of a leper, and then later on brings a paralyzed friend to actually meet Jesus. So let's watch our episode tonight. It's entitled "Indescribable Compassion."